The sun over the Arizona territory was not a friendly, golden thing. It was a merciless white disk in a sky bleached the color of old bone. Heat rose from the cracked, thirsty earth in shimmering waves, making the distant, jagged mountains tremble and dance. Here, the silence was a physical presence, a weight that settled in a man's bones. It was a silence made of immense, empty space, broken only by the whisper of a hot wind through brittle sagebrush or the far-off cry of a hawk. It was a land of profound, brutal beauty, where a man could lose himself or find himself, and where danger was as constant as the sun itself. The air smelled of dust, of sage, of stone baking for 1,000 years. It was the smell of solitude. Into this landscape rode Elias Thorne. He sat his horse with an easy stillness that spoke of countless miles in the saddle. He was not a flashy man. There were no silver conchos on his leather, no fancy tooling on his gun belt. He was a man shaped by hardship, not by vanity. His face was weathered by sun and wind, tanned to the color of worn walnut, with the lines etched around eyes the startling blue of a deep mountain lake. Those eyes held a weariness that had nothing to do with the long road and everything to do with the past he was trying to outride. His clothes were the color of the dust that covered them, functional and faded. His movements were economical, deliberate, with no wasted energy. Even his horse, a tough buckskin gelding named Dust Devil, moved with a steady, ground-eating pace that was built for endurance, not for show. Elias Thorne was not seeking adventure. He was seeking stillness. He was a man running from the cacophony of his own memory, a noise of roaring cannons and the thin, high screams of men at Shiloh and Cold Harbor. He saw Redemption Bluff from a low rise, and it looked small and breakable, a handful of wooden buildings dropped into the vast, indifferent desert. It huddled in the dust as if for protection against the immense backdrop of rock and sky. As he rode closer, the initial impression of fragility was replaced by something else, something oppressive. The main street was wide enough for a freight wagon to turn, yet it felt constricting. There was none of the cheerful noise of a prosperous town, no children laughing, no pleasantries called from across the way. There was only a low, tense hum, the sound of a place holding its breath. The town was split in two, as plain as a line drawn in the dirt. On one side stood the Croft Cattle Company headquarters, a 2-story false front building that was the biggest structure in town, its windows like hard, empty eyes. Next to it was the Croft Saloon, loud and imposing even in the afternoon sun. Across the street, the other businesses seemed to wilt in their shadow. The general store, the blacksmith shop, a small, quiet cantina. The name Croft was burned into the town's very soul. Elias watched the people as he rode down the middle of the street, the cowboys. Anglo men with the Croft brand on their horses and their swagger took up the whole of the boardwalk, forcing others to step aside. They walked with an unthinking arrogance that set his teeth on edge. The Mexican residents, in contrast, moved with a quiet, guarded demeanor. Their eyes were often downcast, their shoulders slightly stooped, as if carrying a weight he could not see but could surely feel. He felt an immediate, instinctual dislike for what he witnessed. It was the same kind of casual, entitled cruelty he had seen in officers who sent good men to die for a patch of worthless ground. It was the posture of power that has never been questioned. He swung down from his horse in front of the livery stable, his boots landing softly in the thick dust. His movements were slow, methodical. He unsaddled Dust Devil, his hands moving over the animal with a gentle, practiced touch, checking for sores, brushing the trail dust from the buckskin's coat. It was a small, quiet moment, but it spoke of a capacity for tenderness in a man who looked like he was carved from hard rock. The livery owner, a stooped old man named Jeb with tobacco stains in his beard, watched him from the shadows of the barn. He was taciturn, his eyes wary. "Looking for work?" Jeb asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Maybe," Elias said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "All the work here is croft work," the old man said. He turned his head and spat a stream of brown juice into the dust. He said the name Croft like it was a curse he was trying to rid his mouth of. Elias left his horse in the old man's care and walked across the street to the general store. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the mingled smells of ground coffee beans, smoked bacon, burlap sacks, and the ever-present dust. Shelves rose to the ceiling, crammed with tins and tools and bolts of cloth. It was in the dim light of the store that he saw her for the first time. She stood at the counter, speaking to the proprietor in a voice that was low but carried a firm, clear note of command. She was not a damsel in the way the dime novels portrayed them, soft and fainting. There was an unyielding strength in her posture, a straightness in her spine that seemed to defy the modest, well-worn quality of her dark dress. Her hair, the color of a raven's wing, was pulled back severely from her face, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame a countenance that was beautiful. Yes, but not in a simple way. Her beauty was etched with worry, with a pride that was almost painful to behold, and in her dark eyes there was a defiant fire. She must have felt his gaze, because she turned her head slightly. Their eyes met across the dimly lit space. It was a brief moment, no longer than a heartbeat, but it felt like a jolt of electricity. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, a quick, sharp appraisal, and then a shudder dropped, a guardedness that was absolute. In that same instant, she saw something in him that was different from the usual coarse drifters and swaggering cowboys who populated the town. She saw a stillness in his clear blue eyes, a quiet intensity that was unsettling and intriguing. She concluded her business quickly, her voice now a murmur. She gathered her small parcel, pulling a dark shawl around her shoulders as if it were a piece of armor, and swept out of the store without a backward glance. Elias stood there for a long moment, feeling a strange, unfamiliar pull, a disturbance in the deep quiet he had traveled so far to find. He had not come here looking for this. He had not come here looking for anything at all. He bought what he needed, coffee, beans, a little bacon, and stepped back out onto the sun-blasted street. And it was then that the fragile piece of Redemption Bluff was torn open. Jedediah Croft, Silas Croft's son, stood in the middle of the street with two of his brutish ranch hands. He was a thick-set man with his father's ambition but none of his cunning, a dangerous combination. His face was fleshy and his mouth was set in a perpetual sneer. They had cornered an elderly Mexican man, Mr. Romero, who stood beside a small, lovingly made wooden cart filled with hand-carved toys. "Your junk is in the way, old man," Jedediah said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Senor Croft, I am not in the way, Mr." Romero protested feebly, his voice trembling. "I am just here." Jedediah did not let him finish. With a lazy, brutal motion, he kicked the leg of the cart. It tipped over with a sad, splintering crash, spilling the little wooden horses and birds and dancing figures into the thick dust. The old man cried out, a sound of pure anguish, and dropped to his knees. Jedediah laughed, a short, ugly bark. When Mr. Romero looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. Jedediah backhanded him across the face. The sound was a flat, wet crack that echoed in the sudden silence. The town froze. A woman across the street hurried her child indoors. Men standing on the boardwalk suddenly found something interesting to look at in the distance. They watched with a mixture of fear and shame, but no one moved. No one said a word. Elias felt a familiar, unwelcome heat rise in his chest. It was the feeling that came before the thunder of the guns, the feeling of an injustice so profound it could not be ignored. He had made a promise to himself when he left the war behind. He would not get involved. His fighting days were over. He was done with other people's battles. He looked at the old man on his knees in the dirt, his shaking hands trying to gather his scattered, broken wares, and the promise shattered like glass. He did not draw his gun. He did not call out a challenge. He simply walked forward, his steps slow and measured, and placed himself between Jedediah and the old man on the ground. His shadow fell over the two of them. "Does this make you feel like a bigger man?" Elias asked. His voice was not loud, but it was low and steady, and it cut through the tense silence like a knife. Jedediah Croft spun around, his face a mottled red with surprise and rage. He had not expected to be interrupted. He was not used to being questioned. "What did you say to me?" he snarled. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the dusty clothes, the stranger's face. "Who the hell are you? Some Yankee drifter?" The confrontation was psychological, not yet physical. Elias remained perfectly still, a calm, solid presence against Jedediah's sputtering fury. He did not flinch, just held the other man's gaze with his clear blue eyes. "I think you owe the man for his toys," Elias said, his voice still level. That was too much for Jedediah. To be challenged was one thing. To be told what to do was another. "The hell I will!" he roared, and his hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. It was a fool's move, born of anger, not sense, in a blur of motion that seemed impossibly fast. Elias did not draw his own weapon. He stepped forward, inside the arc of Jedediah's draw. He caught Jedediah's wrist with one hand, the grip like iron, using Jedediah's own forward momentum. Elias twisted, leveraging the man's arm up behind his back in a painful, incapacitating lock. The pistol fell from Jedediah's numb fingers and landed softly in the dust. It was all done with a swift, brutal efficiency that spoke of long and terrible practice, of endless drills and desperate, close-quarters combat. Elias had not thrown a single punch, but he had utterly humiliated Jedediah Croft in front of his men and half the town. He held him for a moment longer, letting the shame sink in, then released him with a hard shove that sent him staggering. "Go on home," Elias said. His voice was still quiet, but now it was laced with ice. "Your father wouldn't want you starting a fight you can't finish." Jedediah Croft's face was purple with a mixture of rage and shame. He backed away, sputtering a string of threats and curses, before turning and storming off down the street, his two men trailing behind him like curs. Elias knelt and helped Mr. Romero to his feet. He began gathering the scattered toys, placing the unbroken ones back in the old man's hands. "Gracias, señor, muchas gracias." "Mr." Romero whispered, his eyes shining with tears of gratitude. Elias simply nodded, his face grim. He stood up and dusted off his knees. He had won the small battle, but he knew, with a sinking certainty, that he had just made a powerful and unforgiving enemy. As he looked up, his eyes scanned the street and found her, Isabella Montoya. She was standing at the far end of the boardwalk, near the mouth of an alleyway. She had seen the entire thing. Her face was a complex mask of emotions. He could see the gratitude there, but he could also see a profound and terrible fear. She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Before he could react, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the alley. That single look communicated more than words ever could. "Thank you, but you have no idea what you have just done." Seeking work that was not with Croft left him with only one option: the livery owner. Jeb had directed him to the only independent rancher left in the valley, a man named Abel Truman. The ride out to Abel's ranch was an education in itself. The landscape was dominated by the vast, ever-expanding Croft holdings, endless miles of pasture marked by new fences. Abel's place was a small, struggling patch of green tucked into a bend in a nearly dry creek bed. It was a defiant island in the middle of the Croft Sea. The buildings were modest and in need of paint and repair, but the fences were strong and the small herd of cattle looked healthy enough. The entire place had a stubborn air about it, like a gnarled old tree refusing to be uprooted by the wind. Abel Truman himself looked much like his ranch. He was a gnarled, cynical old man with hands like cured leather and a face that was a roadmap of hard years. He had a dry wit and a deep, abiding hatred for Silas Croft that was evident in every word he spoke. He was initially suspicious of Elias, looking him over with shrewd, calculating eyes. "Heard what you did in town," Abel said, not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact. He squinted at Elias. "You serve in the war?" "I did," Elias answered. His voice clipped. He did not offer any more. Abel must have seen something he was looking for in the younger man's steady gaze. In his capable hands, in the quiet way he held himself, he grunted. "The pay ain't much, and the work's hard, and Croft will make it harder." He stuck out a hand. "But the bunkhouse is clean and the coffee's hot. Name's Abel." Elias took the offered hand. It was as rough as a pine cone. "Elias Thorne." "Well, Elias Thorne," Abel said with a grim smile. "You should know something. Working for me is like painting a target on your back. Croft doesn't like competition, no matter how small." In the weeks that followed, Elias settled into the hard, punishing rhythm of ranch work. He mended fences for days on end under the blazing sun, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. He broke horses, feeling the raw, explosive power of the animals between his knees, a struggle of wills that left him bruised and aching but strangely satisfied. At the end of each day, an exhaustion settled deep into his bones, a clean, honest fatigue that was a balm for his troubled mind. It was hard to think of the past when his body was screaming for rest. He and Abel developed a quiet, respectful rapport, the kind of bond that grows between men who share hard work and long silences, built on unspoken understanding. It was almost like having a father again. Through evening conversations over plates of beans and bacon, Elias learned the full, tragic history of the valley. Abel told him how Silas Croft had arrived years ago, not as a cowboy, but as a businessman with a fat wallet and an empty soul. He used a combination of legal trickery, buying up debt, and outright violence to systematically strip the land grants from the Mexican families who had been there for generations. The Montoyas, Abel explained, had once been the most powerful family in the region, their rancho famous for its fine horses and grand fiestas. Now, all that was left was Isabella and her father, a frail, heartbroken man living in a small adobe house on the edge of town, a sad remnant of their former estate. And then Abel told him about the engagement. It was not a matter of love, but of extortion. It was Croft's final, cruel move, a way to legitimize his claim to the last of the Montoya land and to crush the spirit of the few who still remembered a time before him. The knowledge settled like a stone in Elias's gut. His sympathy for the woman with the fiery eyes deepened into a quiet, simmering anger. He began to see her not just as a beautiful woman, but as a prisoner in her own home, being sold to the son of the man who had destroyed her family. He saw her again a week later. He was in town for supplies when he spotted her outside the general store, struggling with a heavy sack of flour that had torn, spilling a white cloud onto the dusty boardwalk. She bent to try and gather the precious, spilled contents, her face a mask of frustration. He approached without a word and knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands helping to scoop the flour back into the burlap. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact of rough skin against smooth, and a jolt went through him, sharp and unexpected. It went through her, too. He saw it in the way she drew a quick, sharp breath. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They stood up, facing each other. "It is no trouble," he said. Their conversation was simple. Just a few words about the dry weather, about the high price of flour. But beneath the surface of the commonplace words, there was a powerful current of all the things they could not say. "You work for Abel Truman now," she stated. It was not a question. News traveled fast in a town this small. "I do." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Approval, perhaps, or solidarity. "You must be careful," she warned, her voice dropping even lower. She glanced nervously down the street. "The Crofts, they do not forgive." It was both a warning and a plea. He could see it then, plain as day. She was afraid for him. She gave him a quick nod and hurried away. Leaving Elias standing alone on the boardwalk, he was left with the lingering scent of her perfume, a faint smell of lilacs that seemed so wildly out of place in the dusty, masculine world of Redemption Bluff. He watched her go, a straight, proud figure walking toward a future she did not want. He realized then that his simple desire for a quiet life was now hopelessly, dangerously complicated. He was no longer a drifter just passing through. He was entangled in the town's silent, bitter war, and at the very center of it was a woman with haunted, defiant eyes whose safety he was beginning to care about more than his own. That evening, Elias sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun bleed across the western sky, bathing the valley in a blood-red light. The landscape was beautiful and terrible. He held his Colt revolver in his lap, a soft rag in his hand, cleaning the weapon with slow, automatic motions he had learned long ago. A grim acceptance settled over him. The peace he had sought was gone, vanished like a mirage in the desert heat. In its place was the familiar, cold weight of an impending fight, and this time, he knew he would not be running from it. Word of what happened in front of the general store spread through the valley like a brush fire. Elias Thorne was no longer just another drifter passing through. He was the man who had faced down Jedediah Croft and walked away. He was a marked man. When he rode into Redemption Bluff now, he could feel the eyes on him. Some looks were filled with fear, the townsfolk scurrying away as if his presence alone might invite trouble. But other looks, from men who had long since swallowed their pride, held a flicker of something else, a newfound, secret respect. A man had stood up, and the sight was so rare it was like witnessing a miracle. The Croft ranch hands, loyal to their paymaster and their own brutish code, made it their business to test his resolve. They would go out of their way to bump into him on the boardwalk. A hard shove of a shoulder meant to provoke. They would mutter insults as he passed, words about Yankees and drifters, just loud enough to be heard. Through it all, Elias met their provocations with a stony, unwavering calm. He would simply sidestep or meet their gaze with his clear blue eyes until they looked away. But he refused to be drawn into a fight on their terms. His quiet refusal to be intimidated was an act of defiance more powerful than any thrown punch. It unnerved them. They understood fists and guns, but they did not understand this quiet, unmovable man. Jedediah Croft, still stinging from the public embarrassment, was not a man to let an insult go. His pride, as vast and fragile as a soap bubble, had been popped. He decided a more direct form of intimidation was in order. Elias was riding the southern fence line for Abel one afternoon, the sun a hot weight on his shoulders, the silence of the hills broken only by the creak of his saddle. It was a remote trail, miles from the ranch house, miles from any witness. That was where they found him. Jedediah and 3 of his riders came over a rise, blocking the path. They did not draw their guns. That would have been too simple, too quick. They wanted to savor it. They fanned out, their horses circling Elias and Dust Devil, hemming him in. The air grew thick with menace. Well, look what we got here," Jedediah sneered, his thick face flushed with a mean sort of pleasure. "The big man, the tough Yankee drifter. You feel tough all alone out here?" Elias remained seated on his horse, his hands resting casually on his saddle horn. He let them circle, his gaze moving slowly, assessing each man. His stillness was a weapon, a calm center in their storm of aggression. "We're here to teach you a lesson," Jedediah continued, his voice rising. "A lesson about respecting your betters. Old man Truman can't protect you out here." Elias finally let his eyes settle on Jedediah. He spoke in a low, even tone, as if they were discussing the weather. He analyzed him, not as a threat, but as a specimen. "Your father's name is the only thing that makes you feel big, isn't it?" Elias said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Without it, you're just a loud boy with a gun." The psychological jab hit its mark with surgical precision. It was the one truth Jedediah could not bear to hear. His face contorted, the sneer wiped away and replaced with pure, unthinking rage. "Why, you—" he sputtered, and his hand flew to his gun. His men followed his lead, their own pistols clearing leather, but they were angry, and their movements were clumsy. Elias was not. In a single fluid motion that was a memory in his muscles, he drew his own Colt. It was in his hand and firing before Jedediah's gun had even leveled. 3 shots cracked in the silence of the hills, deafeningly loud. But Elias had not aimed at the men. He had aimed at the ground, firing into the dirt just in front of their horses' hooves. The animals, already skittish, erupted in panic. They reared up, screaming with terror, their eyes wide. One of the riders was thrown hard, landing with a grunt in the dust. The others fought for control of their spooked mounts. In that split second of complete chaos, Elias's gun was no longer aimed at the ground. It was aimed squarely at Jedediah Croft's chest. "This is your last warning," Elias said, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was cold and flat and final. "Stay away from me. Stay away from Abel. Next time, I won't aim for the ground." He watched them retreat, a disorganized scramble of frightened horses and cursing men. He holstered his pistol, the victory tasting like ash in his mouth. He did not want this violence. He had seen enough violence to last 10 lifetimes, but it had found him nonetheless, here in this place where he had only sought quiet. Silas Croft was a far more intelligent and dangerous man than his son. When he heard of this second, more humiliating failure, he realized that Elias Thorne was not some common drifter who could be easily scared off or beaten down. Silas Croft was a man in his late 50s, but he carried himself with the vitality of a man 20 years younger. He was always impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, even here on the frontier, a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of the men around him. He had cold, calculating gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a voice as smooth as polished river stone. He did not rule his empire through brute force alone. He ruled through manipulation, through the careful twisting of the law, and through the precise, surgical application of terror. Silas decided on a new tactic. A week later, one of his foremen delivered a message to Abel's ranch. It was an invitation for Elias to dine at the Croft house. Abel advised against it. "That's a spider inviting a fly into his web," the old man had warned. But Elias knew he could not refuse. To do so would be a sign of fear. The Croft ranch house was an obscenity of wealth in the impoverished valley. It was a sprawling, 2-story lumber mansion with glass windows that had been hauled by wagon from 100 miles away. Inside, the rooms were filled with dark, heavy furniture that belonged in a Boston drawing room, not an Arizona ranch. The walls were covered with the mounted heads of deer, elk, and one enormous, glassy-eyed grizzly bear. The entire place smelled of leather, whiskey, and a pervasive, suffocating sense of power. Silas Croft greeted Elias not as a ranch hand, but as an equal. He offered him a glass of expensive whiskey in a crystal tumbler. "I've heard a great deal about you." "Mr. Thorne," Silas said, his voice a low, pleasant purr. He gestured for Elias to sit in a deep leather chair. "You have a certain composure, a set of skills that are wasted on a failing enterprise like Abel Truman's." He talked for a long time about the inevitability of progress, about how the valley needed strong men to tame it and bring it into the future. It was a masterclass in veiled threats and poisoned compliments. Finally, he got to the point. "I need a new foreman," Silas said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "A man who is not afraid to take charge. The salary would make you a wealthy man. Mr. Thorne, you could have your own piece of this valley. A man like you shouldn't be wasting his time with a relic like Abel Truman. His time has passed. The future of this valley is with me." The offer was as clear as the crystal in his hand. Join me, or be destroyed along with the rest of the past. Elias met the man's cold gaze. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Croft," he said politely but firmly. "But I gave Abel my word. I'm not a man who goes back on it." Silas Croft's smile never wavered, but it did not reach his eyes. His eyes turned to chips of ice. A misplaced loyalty is a dangerous thing. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his smooth voice taking on a deadly edge. "It can get a man killed." Elias left the ranch house with the setting sun at his back and a chill deep in his bones that had nothing to do with the evening air. He had the chilling certainty that he had just looked into the face of the true evil in Redemption Bluff. Meanwhile, the fragile, unspoken connection between him and Isabella Montoya deepened. Their encounters were fleeting, stolen moments fraught with risk. A few hushed words exchanged in the shadows of the livery stable while he was tending to his horse. A quick, charged glance across the crowded general store. In these brief meetings, they began to confide in each other, sharing small pieces of themselves like precious contraband. He told her a little about the war, not about the battles and the bloodshed, but about the crushing weariness that came after. He spoke of the loss of his family's small farm in Ohio while he was away, of returning to find nothing left for him, of the feeling of being utterly untethered from the world. He spoke of his search for a place to simply be still, a place where the ghosts of the past could not find him. She, in turn, revealed the crushing weight of her own reality. She described her father, once a proud and vibrant patriarch, now a man broken by the loss of his land and his wife, who lived more in the world of memory than in the present. She spoke of the daily humiliations she endured, the constant, unwanted presence of Jedediah, the suffocating feeling of her impending marriage. She did not have to explain the reasons for the engagement. He already understood it was a sacrifice, her last desperate attempt to secure a small piece of existence for her father. In these whispered conversations, they saw the wounded, vulnerable person behind the public facade. The fierce attraction that had sparked between them was no longer just physical. It was a meeting of two lonely, embattled souls finding a rare and dangerous solace in each other. Isabella stood in the main room of her small adobe home. The house was always clean, always well kept, but it was filled with the ghosts of a grander past. On a small table sat a single, tarnished silver candlestick, the last of a set that had once graced a long dining table. On the wall hung a faded but beautiful tapestry depicting a vibrant fiesta, a relic from a life that felt like a dream. Her father sat in his usual chair by the window, his hands resting on a woolen blanket, staring blankly out at the dusty yard. He was there, but he was not. The sound of an approaching horse made her stomach clench. It was Jedediah. His visits were a regular torment. He filled the small space with his bulk, his loud voice, his smell of whiskey and cheap cigars. Today, he brought her a gift, thrusting a small box into her hands. Inside was a necklace, a gaudy thing of gold-colored metal and bright blue glass stones. "For my future wife," he said, his voice thick with possessiveness. He moved closer, his hand reaching out to touch her neck. "Let me put it on you." Her revulsion was a physical thing, a cold sickness that rose from her stomach to her throat. She flinched, almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, Jedediah. I can do it myself," she said, her voice a rigid, icy sliver of politeness. He mistook it for submission, as he always did. He grunted, satisfied, and spent the next 20 minutes bragging about a horse he had broken, a card game he had won. She stood there, a perfect, still statue of courtesy, her mind 1,000 miles away. The moment the sound of his horse faded, she walked to the wash basin and scrubbed her hands, scrubbing the place on her neck where his fingers had almost touched. She felt contaminated, unclean. Her thoughts turned, as they so often did, to Elias Thorne. She thought of his quiet strength, of the respectful way he looked at her, as if he saw not just a woman, but a person. The contrast between the two men was an agony that twisted inside her. A strange and unexpected thing began to happen in Redemption Bluff. Inspired by Elias's quiet defiance, a few other people began to push back in small ways. Mr. Romero, the old toy maker, set up his cart again, though he now stayed closer to the cantina, on the Mexican side of the street. Cole, the burly, decent man who ran the blacksmith shop, politely but firmly refused to drop a farmer's plowshare to shoe one of Croft's horses, telling the ranch hand he would have to wait his turn like everyone else. These were tiny acts of rebellion, but in the oppressive atmosphere of the town, they felt monumental. Elias felt a reluctant sense of pride when he saw these things, but it was quickly followed by a growing dread. He knew Silas Croft would not tolerate this shifting of the ground beneath his feet, no matter how small. The retaliation, when it came, was swift and brutal. There was another small rancher in the valley, a man named Henderson, who owned a small plot of land upstream from Abel. At a town meeting a month prior, Henderson had spoken out, his voice shaking but determined, against Croft's practice of damming the creek for his own herds, leaving downstream neighbors with only a trickle. One morning, Henderson was found dead. He was discovered at the bottom of a deep ravine, his body broken. His horse was found nearby with a broken leg. The sheriff, a paunchy, lazy man who was firmly in Croft's pocket, rode out, took one look, and quickly ruled it an accident. Man's horse stumbled in the dark. A terrible tragedy, he declared to anyone who would listen, officially closing the case before it was ever truly opened. Elias and Abel rode out to the Henderson place to offer their condolences to his distraught widow, while Abel spoke to the woman in low, comforting tones. Elias walked out to the edge of the ravine. His time in the war had taught him many things, and one of them was how to read the ground, how to see the story that was left behind in the dirt. His tracking skills, honed by years of scouting, kicked in. He saw things the sheriff had conveniently overlooked. He saw the tracks of not one horse, but three, coming from the direction of the Croft ranch. He found a scuffed patch of ground a few feet from the edge, the kind of mark left by the heels of a man trying to resist being pushed. And then he saw it, half buried in the dust beneath a greasewood bush, a single, expensive cigar butt, the kind Silas Croft was known to smoke. He stood up, a cold, sickening certainty washing over him. Henderson had not fallen. He was ambushed, beaten, and thrown into the ravine. This realization was a significant turning point. The conflict was no longer about intimidation and land grabs. It was about cold-blooded murder. The abstract threat had become terrifyingly, horribly real. That evening, he told Abel his suspicions. The old man's face, already etched with decades of hardship, seemed to cave in on itself. He sat down heavily in his chair, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "I knew it would come to this," Abel whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Silas won't stop until he has it all, until he's the only one left standing." Later that night, Elias met Isabella. It was a prearranged, desperate meeting by the nearly dry creek bed that ran behind the town. The moon was just a sliver in the star-dusted sky, and the darkness felt both intimate and dangerous, a cloak that could hide them or their enemies. He told her about Henderson, about what he had found. He told her she was not safe, that her engagement to Jedediah would not protect her. It would only seal her fate, make her another one of Croft's possessions. The fear in her dark eyes was palpable, a living thing in the moonlight, but it was not just for herself. "They will kill you, Elias," she said, her voice trembling. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm in her first voluntary physical contact. The touch was like a brand. "You cannot fight them alone." He covered her hand with his own. Her hand was so small, so delicate within his calloused one. "I don't know how to do anything else," he admitted, his own voice rough with an emotion he could not name. They stood there for a long moment in the charged silence, the immense, dark landscape of the Arizona night a witness to their shared fear and their undeniable, blossoming connection. The faint glimmer of hope that had sparked in the town had been brutally extinguished, replaced by the grim, cold reality of their situation. And in the darkness, they had only each other. The atmosphere in Redemption Bluff soured and curdled, like milk left too long in the sun. Henderson's accidental death was a message, and it had been received by everyone in the valley, a pall of fear, thick and suffocating, settled over the town, extinguishing the few small sparks of defiance that had begun to glow. People retreated back into a posture of quiet survival, their heads down, their mouths shut. Cole the blacksmith, who had once stood his ground, was now sullen and grim, his hammer falling with a joyless thud. He avoided Elias's eyes when he came into town. Mr. Romero's little wooden cart, with its hopeful, hand-carved toys, no longer appeared on the street. The power of Silas Croft was absolute once more, a monolith of terror that cast a shadow over every life. For Elias, the isolation was more profound than ever. He was a lightning rod, and people were afraid to stand too close to him. Even Abel became more withdrawn, the cynical humor in his eyes replaced by a grim fatalism. He spent his evenings on the porch not talking, but methodically cleaning his old rifle. The soft clicks of the mechanism, a somber rhythm in the twilight. It was the action of a man preparing for an end he saw as inevitable. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, the bond between Elias and Isabella intensified. They were drawn to each other like moths to a flame, both of them knowing, with a deep and certain dread, that the fire would likely consume them. Their secret meetings became more frequent, more desperate, stolen from a world that wanted to keep them apart. They found hidden places that became their own private sanctuaries. A secluded grove of cottonwood trees by the creek, their leaves whispering secrets in the breeze. The crumbling, sun-bleached ruins of an old Spanish mission chapel just outside of town, where they could sit in the shadow of a fallen bell tower and talk without fear of being seen. It was in these stolen moments that they began to share the parts of themselves they had never shown to anyone else, creating a deeper, more fragile intimacy. One evening, sitting in the ruins of the chapel as the sky turned a soft violet, Elias finally spoke of the thing that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. "Shiloh," he began, his voice low and rough, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. The noise. I don't think people who weren't there could ever understand the noise. It wasn't just guns. It was a constant roar, like the world was ending, and in the middle of it, thousands of men screaming. He paused, swallowing hard. We were in a thicket, a horrible place the men called the Hornet's Nest. We were fighting over nothing, a few hundred yards of woods and brambles. A boy came out of the smoke. He couldn't have been more than 16. He had this thin blonde fuzz on his chin instead of a real beard. He was wearing a butternut uniform, and his eyes were wide with terror. He raised his rifle, but he was fumbling with it, scared out of his mind. Elias's own hands clenched into fists in his lap. I didn't think. I just reacted. My bayonet. He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. I still see his face, every night, the surprise in his eyes. He didn't even look angry. Just surprised. It was a confession he had never made, a poison he had held inside for more than a decade. The act of telling her was a profound gesture of trust, a laying down of his heaviest burden at her feet. He had revealed the source of his weariness, the reason he had traveled 1,000 miles seeking a peace he was beginning to believe he would never find. Isabella listened, her heart aching for him, and in the safety of his vulnerability, she offered him her own. She told him about her mother, a strong, vibrant woman with a laugh like music, who had loved their rancho with a fierce passion. After Croft took the land, Isabella said, her voice a soft murmur. Something in her broke. The doctor said it was her heart, that it just grew weak. But I know. She died of a broken heart. She couldn't bear to see what had been lost. She described the beauty and life of their home before Croft's arrival. The fiestas that lasted for days. The air filled with the sounds of guitars and laughter. The sense of community, of family that extended to every vaquero and servant. Her stories were filled with a deep, aching nostalgia. But beneath the sadness was a quiet, burning anger at what had been stolen from them, from her father, from her mother's memory. In sharing their deepest wounds, they built a sanctuary for each other against the harshness of their world. They were no longer just a man and a woman drawn together by attraction, but two survivors who had found in the other a place to rest their weary souls. A few weeks later, a notice was posted in town. Silas Croft, in a grand display of his supposed benevolence, was sponsoring a barn dance to celebrate the founding of the town. Everyone was expected to attend. It was a command disguised as an invitation. "Don't go," Abel urged Elias that evening. "It's a snake pit. No good can come of it." But Elias knew he had to. He saw it as his only opportunity to speak with Isabella in a more open setting, to see her without having to hide in the shadows. He knew she would be there. She had no choice. She had to attend on the arm of Jedediah Croft. The barn was decorated with colorful streamers and dozens of lanterns that cast a warm, golden glow. A trio of fiddlers sawed away at a lively tune, but the gaiety felt hollow, forced. The space was sharply divided. The Croft contingent, their cowboys and foremen, were loud and drunk, their laughter booming unnaturally in the cavernous space. The rest of the townspeople were subdued, clustered in small, quiet groups, their faces strained with polite smiles. Elias stood in the shadows near the large open doors, watching, and then he saw her. Isabella was being paraded around the dance floor by a preening Jedediah. She wore a simple white dress, a family heirloom of soft, aged lace. She moved with a graceful dignity that was so innate it made her seem like a queen in exile, a splash of pure light in the raucous, smoky room. Her face was a perfect, polite mask, but Elias, who had learned to read the subtle language of her eyes, could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the deep, swimming misery in her gaze when she thought no one was looking. Jedediah, already flushed with whiskey, was possessive and crude. He treated her like a trophy he had won, his thick hand always on the small of her back or her arm, his voice loud and proprietary as he introduced her to his cronies. Elias felt a hot, primitive anger building inside him. It was a jealousy so fierce it surprised him with its intensity. It was the feeling of a man watching something precious being soiled. He forced himself to remain calm, to lean against the rough-hewn wood of the barn wall and wait for his moment. His chance came when Jedediah, his chest puffed out, was pulled into a drunken bragging session with a circle of his men. Isabella was left standing alone near the long table that held the punch bowl. She looked small and profoundly lonely. Elias pushed himself off the wall and moved toward her, his path deliberate. The noise of the party seemed to fade into a background hum as he approached. He stopped beside her. She did not look at him, but he saw her hands tremble slightly as she clutched her cup of punch. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the dancers. "He shouldn't have to see you like this," Elias replied, his voice low and intense, meant only for her. "This isn't you." Her carefully constructed mask finally cracked. A single tear escaped and traced a glistening path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "There is so little of me left," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. He acted on pure instinct. He took her arm gently. "Come outside." He led her out of the barn, away from the suffocating heat and the lantern light, into the cool, clean air of the night. Behind the barn, the world was quiet. The stars were a brilliant, silent canopy above them, a spray of diamonds on black velvet. There, in the relative privacy of the deep shadows, the emotion they had been so carefully suppressing finally overflowed. He reached up and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with the pad of his thumb, his touch rough but tender. "He will not break you," Elias said, and it was more a vow than a statement. "I won't let him." She looked up at him then, her dark eyes searching his face in the faint moonlight. All the fear, all the loneliness, all the simmering fight left within her came to a head in that one shattering moment. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, hungry, filled with all the pent-up longing and despair of her suffocating life. It was a cry for help and an act of rebellion all at once. He responded with an equal, overwhelming fervor, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her tight against his chest as if he could absorb all her pain into himself. as if he could shield her from the world with his own body. It was a moment of pure, reckless abandon. A stolen piece of heaven in a world that was rapidly becoming hell. They were so lost in each other that they did not hear the man stumbling out of the barn door until he was almost upon them. He was one of Jedediah's men, drunk and looking for a place to be sick. They broke apart, their hearts pounding against their ribs. The spell shattered. The near discovery was a harsh douse of cold water, reminding them of the terrible, deadly risk they were taking. Isabella gave him one last, desperate, anguished look, her eyes wide in the darkness. Then she turned and fled back into the barn before her absence could be truly noted, leaving him alone in the shadows with the ghost of her touch on his lips. The next day, the consequences of Croft's renewed aggression arrived at Abel's ranch. It was not a direct attack with men and guns, but something slower, crueler. A crucial dam on the creek far upstream, on Croft-controlled land, was closed off. The water supply to Abel's property, their lifeblood, was cut to a mere trickle. It was a slow, deliberate death sentence for the ranch. Within days, the cattle began to suffer, their lowing taking on a pained, thirsty edge. The small patch of alfalfa that Abel cultivated for winter feed began to turn from green to a sickly yellow-brown. Elias and Abel worked relentlessly, their bodies pushed to the breaking point. They dug ditches, trying to divert what little water remained, their shovels ringing against the hard, dry earth. They explored old, dried-up springs, hoping for a miracle. But it was a losing battle. The physical labor was grueling, and with their water barrels running low, their own supplies started to dwindle. It was a siege, a war of attrition, and they both knew it. Isabella, meanwhile, was consumed with a terrible mixture of guilt and fear. The memory of the kiss behind the barn was a constant, burning fire within her. She was terrified for Elias, knowing that Croft's attention was now fully focused on him and Abel. She decided, with a clarity that came from desperation, that she could no longer be a passive victim, a pawn in their game. Her opportunity came unexpectedly. While in town, forced to endure a meeting with Silas Croft about wedding arrangements, she overheard a conversation between him and the sheriff. They spoke in low tones, confident of their privacy. But she heard enough. They were waiting for Abel's ranch to be on the very brink of collapse from the lack of water. Then, they would send men to offer a pittance for the land, if Abel refused, as they knew he would. The sheriff was prepared to act on a fabricated rustling charge. Claiming a few of Croft's cattle had been found on Abel's land, they would arrest them both. Risking everything, Isabella acted. She wrote a hasty note on a scrap of paper. That evening, she found Mr. Romero's young grandson, a boy of 10 whose family had served hers for generations, pressing a coin into his hand. She gave him the note and simple, urgent instructions. The boy, loyal and brave, slipped out of town in the dead of night and ran the long miles to Abel's ranch. Elias was cleaning tack in the barn when the boy arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, and pushed the crumpled note into his hand. The note was simple, its words scrawled in charcoal. They plan to frame you. Rustling. A trap. Be ready. This single dangerous act transformed Isabella. She was no longer just a sympathetic figure, a victim of Croft's tyranny. She was an active participant in the rebellion. She had chosen a side, and her choice was Elias. Jedediah, meanwhile, was not as stupid as he often appeared. He had noticed Isabella's absence at the dance, however brief. He had seen the heightened, frantic emotion in her eyes when she returned, his suspicion and jealousy, already simmering, now boiled over. He began to watch her constantly, his eyes filled with a new, menacing possessiveness. One afternoon, he confronted her in the small garden behind her house. "Where were you at the dance?" he demanded. "You were gone." "I needed some air," she replied, her voice cold. "You were with him, weren't you?" he snarled. That Yankee drifter. You have feelings for him." She turned on him, her dark eyes blazing with a cold fury that startled him. "Do not ever speak to me that way," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You are not my husband yet." Her righteous anger silenced him, for the moment, but the seed of violent certainty had been planted in his mind. That night, Elias sat in the quiet bunkhouse, the only light coming from a single kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. He read Isabella's note again and again. Her words, her incredible courage, filled him with a fierce, protective love so powerful it almost took his breath away. But that love was coupled with a cold, creeping dread. Croft was not just trying to starve them out. He was setting a trap, a legal snare from which there would be no escape. Elias stood and walked to the small window, looking out into the darkness. In the distance, he could see a few lights from the formidable shadow that was the Croft Ranch. The fight for water, for land, had now become deeply, irrevocably personal. It was a fight for the woman he loved and against the man who sought to own her. He was no longer just defending Abel's property. He was defending their future, a future that seemed more impossible and more worth fighting for than ever. A palpable sense of impending doom settled over the valley, as thick and choking as smoke. The land was tinder dry. The sun had baked the last of the moisture from the earth, and the creek bed that ran through Abel's property was nothing but a scar of cracked mud and bleached stones. The water was gone. The small herd of cattle, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides, stood listlessly near the empty troughs, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint of thirst. The patch of pasture that had once been Abel's pride, a defiant square of green, was now a brown, cracked wasteland. Elias and Abel moved through the dying ranch like ghosts. They were exhausted, their faces grim masks of dust and fatigue. Conversation had dwindled to a few sparse, necessary words. They were rationing their own water now, each sip from the canteen a careful, measured act. They were living on the edge of a cliff, and they could feel the ground crumbling beneath their feet. Armed with Isabella's warning, Elias tried to prepare for a battle he knew was coming. He spent the days working with Abel, and the evenings fortifying the ranch. He checked the hinges on the doors, scouted lines of sight from the windows, and kept his Colt and his Winchester clean and loaded. He slept lightly, his ears tuned to the night sounds, expecting the thunder of hooves at any moment. But beneath the preparations, a terrible sense of responsibility gnawed at him. He knew, with a certainty that was a bitter poison in his gut, that his presence here had accelerated Croft's aggression. He had drawn the lightning, and now Abel, the only man who had shown him kindness, was standing in the storm with him. The guilt weighed on him more heavily than the Arizona sun. The attack, when it finally came, was not a direct assault of fire and bullets. Croft's methods were more insidious, more cruel. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood, Abel picked up his old rifle. "Gonna make one last check on the herd," he said, his voice weary. "See if any of them have wandered off looking for a puddle." Elias nodded. "I'll be here." He watched the old man walk toward the barn, his shoulders stooped but his back still straight. An hour passed, then two. The sky faded from purple to a deep, star-littered black. Elias sat on the porch, a growing knot of ice forming in his stomach. Abel was never gone this long. He called out the old man's name, his voice swallowed by the immense silence of the night. There was no answer. He waited through the long, dark hours, every nerve stretched taut, a silent scream of dread building inside him. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the eastern peaks, he could wait no longer. He saddled Dust Devil and went searching. He found him near a dried-up watering hole a mile from the ranch house. Abel was lying on the ground, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His head was bloodied, a dark stain matting his white hair. His rifle lay in the dust a few feet from his outstretched hand. His horse stood nearby, its reins trailing, grazing listlessly on the sparse, dry grass. To a casual eye, the story was simple and tragic. The horse had stumbled or spooked. The old man had been thrown, and his head had struck one of the many rocks that littered the landscape. This, Elias knew, would be the official story. But Elias Thorne was not a casual eye. His vision had been sharpened by the horrors of war, his mind trained to see the brutal truths of violence. He swung down from his horse, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He knelt beside the man who had become his friend, his mentor, his only family. He saw the faint, almost erased boot prints of several men in the dust around the body, scuffed and blurred, but there, he gently turned Abel's head and saw a small, deep bruise on his jaw, a dark purple mark that was stark against the pale skin, a bruise inconsistent with any fall. He reached for Abel's rifle. He checked the mechanism with a practiced thumb. It had not been fired. Abel Truman was a veteran rancher who had lived his whole life in this hard country. He would not have been caught so unaware by his own horse in his own pasture. He had been ambushed, beaten, his death staged to look like a sorrowful accident. Elias reached out and took his old friend's lifeless hand. It was already cool to the touch. In that moment, something inside him broke. He was overwhelmed by a wave of grief so profound it threatened to drown him. But right behind it came a soul-crushing rage. It was not the hot, explosive anger he had felt toward Jedediah. This was a rage that was cold and silent and absolute. It was a profound, world-altering fury that burned away everything else inside him, the hope for peace, the weariness, the desire for a quiet life. The last vestiges of the man who had sought stillness died there in the dust next to Abel's body. The soldier he had tried so hard to bury was fully, terribly resurrected. He brought Abel back to the ranch. The task of lifting the old man's limp body onto his own horse was a grim, difficult struggle. The ride back was a slow, funereal procession under the blank, indifferent gaze of the morning sun. The silence of the ranch house when he arrived was no longer peaceful. It was the deafening silence of an empty shell, a place where life had been and was no more. The sheriff, summoned by a neighbor who had seen Elias ride in with his grim burden, arrived a few hours later. His investigation was a sham. He gave the body a cursory glance from a distance, wrote a few notes in a little book, and pronounced it a tragic accident. "A terrible thing," the sheriff said, offering his insincere condolences, his eyes refusing to meet Elias's. Old man must have just lost his seat. Elias watched him, his expression unreadable, his face a mask of stone. His right hand rested on the porch railing, never far from the butt of his gun. He said nothing. He let the sheriff's lies hang in the hot, still air, and his refusal to even argue, to dignify the lie with a response, was more menacing than any threat he could have uttered. Elias buried Abel himself. He chose a small hill that overlooked the failing ranch, a place where the old man had often liked to sit and watch the sunset. He dug the grave with a methodical, relentless energy, his muscles straining, the sweat stinging his eyes. Each shovel of dry, rocky earth was a testament to his grief and a silent vow of vengeance. There was no preacher, no ceremony, no words spoken over the grave. It was a lonely, silent farewell between two men who had understood each other without needing many words at all. As he pushed the last of the dirt into place, he paused, leaning on the handle of the shovel, his chest heaving. He looked up, his eyes scanning the surrounding ridges, and he saw her, a lone figure on a distant rise, Isabella, sitting on her horse. She was too far away for him to see her face clearly, but he knew it was her. She could not come closer, could not risk being seen, but she was there, bearing witness, sharing his grief from afar in the only way she could. Her silent presence was a small, profound comfort in his vast and desolate sorrow. The days that followed were a blur of grief and a simmering, ice-cold rage. Elias moved like a ghost through the ranch, doing the necessary chores out of pure, ingrained habit. He fed the horses, patched a fence, drew water from the nearly dry well. The silence of the place was deafening, a constant reminder of the gruff, kind voice that was gone forever. A few days after the burial, 2 of Croft's men rode up to the ranch house. They did not dismount. One of them held out a letter. "From Mr. Croft," he said with a smirk. Elias took the letter. He tore it open. It was a formal, condescending offer from Silas to buy the ranch for a pittance, the words dripping with false sympathy. Out of respect for poor old Abel. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so vile, it was like a slap in the face. Without a word, Elias tore the letter into small pieces and let the hot wind scatter them. "Get off this land," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the flat, hard finality of a closing coffin. That night, something shifted in him for good, consumed by his grief and his desire for revenge. He changed his tactics. He was no longer on the defensive, waiting for the next blow to fall. He became a hunter. As darkness fell over the valley, he saddled Dust Devil, checked his weapons, and rode out, his face set like stone. He would not go after the men directly. Not yet. He would attack Croft's empire. He would make the man bleed where it hurt him most, his wallet and his pride. He used the skills he had learned in the war, the dark arts of stealth and sabotage. One night, he cut miles of fences on the northern edge of the Croft holdings, allowing hundreds of prize cattle to scatter across the open range. It would take dozens of ranch hands weeks to round them all up. A few nights later, he used his knowledge of the terrain to start a rock slide in a narrow pass, blocking the main road to the railhead just as a major cattle shipment was due to go out. The delay would cost Croft a fortune in lost contracts. On another night, under a moonless sky, he started a small, carefully controlled fire that burned a massive section of Croft's best grazing land, a black, ugly scar that would render the pasture unusable for the rest of the year. He moved like a phantom in the night, leaving behind just enough evidence to let Silas Croft know that these events were deliberate acts of war, but never enough to be tracked. The valley was soon filled with whispers about the ghost that was plaguing the Croft ranch. The Croft hands became jumpy, spooked by every shadow, every coyote's cry. Silas Croft, a man who built his life on control, was enraged. His power was being challenged in a way it never had been before. He put a substantial bounty on the head of the man responsible, and everyone in the valley knew he meant Elias Thorne. Isabella heard the whispers, and her heart was torn in two. She was terrified for Elias, for the lonely, dangerous path he had chosen, but she was also filled with a fierce, secret pride. She saw his actions for what they were, a fight for justice, justice for Abel, for her family, for everyone the Crofts had crushed under their boot heel. Her love for him was now hopelessly mingled with a deep, aching fear that his quest for vengeance would lead him directly to his own grave. She tried to see him. One afternoon, she rode out toward the ranch, a desperate need to know he was safe driving her on. But he was gone. She found the ranch empty, the house shuttered, a profound sense of loss and danger hanging over the silent yard. He was already a phantom in the hills. Before she left, she dismounted and placed a small package of dried meat and bread she had brought, along with a full canteen of fresh water. On the porch, it was a small, inadequate gesture of care in the face of the overwhelming violence that had consumed their lives. Far up in the rocky hills that bordered the valley, Elias watched the lights of the sprawling Croft ranch from a high, hidden vantage point. He was gaunt, his face now covered with a dark, rough beard, his clear blue eyes burning with a cold fire. He was no longer just a cowboy, no longer a man seeking peace. He was an instrument of vengeance, an outlaw by his own making. He sat with his back against a rock, methodically cleaning his rifle. The familiar, mechanical movements, a form of meditation in the vast darkness. He knew this path could only end in one of two ways, with Silas Croft's destruction or with his own. And in his current state, stripped bare by grief and rage, he was not sure he cared which it was. as long as justice for Abel was served. The tension in the valley had been pulled taut, as thin and fragile as a strand of spider silk, and now it was at its breaking point. Elias Thorne's one-man war of sabotage had done more than just cost Silas Croft money and cattle. It had chipped away at the man's most prized possession, his reputation for invincibility. Men who had once spoken Croft's name in hushed, fearful tones now whispered about the ghost in the hills, the phantom who struck at will and could not be caught. For Silas Croft, a man who loathed being made to look weak with a visceral passion, this was an intolerable humiliation. Consumed by a cold, calculating fury, he understood that he could not catch this ghost with hounds and trackers. He needed a different kind of trap. He needed bait that the ghost would be unable to resist, and a cage forged from the very law he had so expertly twisted to his own purposes. He decided to use Isabella as the bait and murder as the crime. He orchestrated the event with the precision of a master chess player. He chose one of his own men, a hard case named Frank Miller, a known rustler and troublemaker whom Croft had been meaning to get rid of anyway. It was a simple matter to send Miller out to a remote section of land bordering Abel's now empty ranch. A few of Croft's most loyal men met him there. The next morning, Miller was found with a bullet in his back. To make the trap perfect, Croft needed evidence. He remembered his son's story of the initial scuffle in town, and a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. A distinctive brass button, bearing the mark of a Union Army supplier, had torn from the drifter's coat. One of Jedediah's men had pocketed it as a small trophy. Silas retrieved the button. It was found, as if by chance, clutched in the dead man's hand. The corrupt sheriff played his part with practiced ease. He formed a posse within the hour, his voice ringing with false indignation as he spoke of the cold-blooded murder of an innocent ranch hand. An official warrant was issued for the arrest of Elias Thorne. The bounty on his head was doubled. Elias was no longer a vigilante or a ghost. He was a wanted fugitive, a murderer in the eyes of the law. Silas Croft, for his part, made a grand public display of his sorrow, vowing before the assembled townspeople that he would not rest until justice was done for his loyal employee. When Isabella heard the news, a wave of cold horror washed over her. She knew, with the absolute certainty of her heart, that it was a frame-up, a lie crafted with deadly intent. Her ever-present fear for Elias's life became a frantic, desperate need to warn him, to scream to the heavens that it was all a lie. But at that very moment, the walls of her own prison tightened, squeezing the very air from her lungs. Silas Croft made another announcement. In light of the shocking violence and lawlessness that had gripped their peaceful valley, he was moving up the wedding. For Isabella's own safety and protection, she and Jedediah would be married in 3 days. It was a brilliant, cruel strategic move, a way to solidify his power, demoralize any remaining opponents, and send a final, brutal message of victory over both the ghost in the hills and the last of the Montoya legacy. Isabella was now effectively a prisoner in her own home. 2 of Croft's men were stationed outside her small adobe house day and night, their presence a constant, suffocating reminder of her fate. She felt the walls closing in, the future shrinking to a single, terrible point in time. A profound and crushing sense of hopelessness began to wash over her, eroding the defiant spirit that had sustained her for so long. She had one last desperate act of rebellion left in her. She summoned the young son of her family's former housekeeper, a boy named Mateo, whom she had known his whole life and trusted implicitly. In the dead of night, while her guards were distracted, she pressed a small, precious silver locket into his hand as payment. With it, she gave him a message. It was not written on paper, but on a piece of cloth she had torn from the hem of her own simple dress. Using a piece of charcoal from the hearth, she had scribbled a few desperate words. Trap. They know where you are. Run. Wedding in 3 days. Mateo, his young face solemn, slipped out into the darkness and ran. A small, brave messenger on a mission of life and death. Elias, holed up in a forgotten line shack high in the Rocky country. Received the message the next day. The boy found him, exhausted and terrified, and delivered the small scrap of cloth. The news hit Elias like a physical blow, knocking the wind from his lungs. He understood Croft's gambit perfectly, in all its vicious clarity. The frame-up was designed to force him to run, to brand him a coward and a killer in the eyes of the world. And the wedding. The wedding was the final turn of the screw. A personal message of defeat meant only for him. It was Croft's way of saying, "I have taken everything. Now I will take her too." His first instinct, the deeply ingrained instinct of a soldier and a survivor, was to follow her advice, to run, to saddle Dust Devil and disappear into the vast, anonymous territories, to ride until Redemption Bluff was nothing more than a bad memory. But then he looked at the piece of cloth in his hand. It was soft, worn from many washings. He held it to his face, and he could still smell the faint, ghostly scent of lilacs that always clung to her. He thought of her face, of the fire in her eyes, of the incredible courage it had taken for her to send this warning. He thought of Abel's body lying in the dust, of the old man's kindness and his lonely, unavenged death. He realized that to run now would be the ultimate betrayal. It would be a betrayal of Abel's memory, a betrayal of Isabella's faith in him, and a betrayal of the man he had once, long ago, tried to be. He could not run. He had to go back. He knew, with a cold, clear certainty, that it was a suicide mission. He would be walking directly into Silas Croft's trap, but it was a choice he had to make. The climax of Silas Croft's grand plan began at dusk on the third day, confident that Elias Thorne was either long gone or would be easily hunted down by the posse. Croft set his final, brutal vision in motion. He was not just content with taking the land. He wanted to purify the valley, to erase any lingering trace of opposition. He sent his men, led by a gleeful and drunken Jedediah, out into the night. They carried torches. Their targets were the small ranches of the few remaining families who had shown any sympathy towards Elias, including the blacksmith Cole and the family of Mr. Romero. Their orders were simple: burn them out. Create a series of wildfires that could be blamed on the desperate, rampaging outlaw Elias Thorne. It would clear the valley for good, leaving nothing but Croft land from one end to the other. The night of the intended wedding arrived. A storm was brewing on the western horizon, the clouds building into a dark, bruised wall. The air was thick, heavy, and electric with unspoken tension. Distant. Heat lightning flickered silently, illuminating the edges of the clouds. In her small room, Isabella stood before a mirror. She was dressed in a beautiful white lace dress, a Montoya family heirloom passed down from her grandmother. It should have been a symbol of hope and joy. Tonight, it felt like a shroud. She was in a state of near catatonic despair. Her fight had finally gone out of her. The relentless pressure, the grief for Abel, the terror for Elias, the finality of her own fate, it had all culminated in a soul-deep exhaustion that was heavier than any chain. She looked at her reflection and saw a stranger, a pale ghost with haunted, empty eyes. The desire to fight, to resist, was gone. It had been replaced by a dark, insidious whisper in the back of her mind. Just let it be over. Surrender. Let the pain stop. This was her own desire now, not for love or freedom, but for oblivion, for the sweet, final relief of giving up. Elias returned to Redemption Bluff under the cover of the deepening twilight and the approaching storm. He moved through the shadows of the alleyways and the spaces between buildings, a ghost in truth, his face a grim mask of determination. From the edge of town, he saw it, the angry orange glow of fires burning in the distance. He knew he was almost too late. The final confrontation did not take place at the town's small church. It took place at the Croft Ranch House, where a perverse and triumphant wedding celebration was already underway. Elias, using his knowledge of the terrain he had studied from the hills, bypassed the armed guards stationed at the main gate, circling around and coming in from the rear. The showdown that followed was not a classic Western duel in the street. It was chaotic, desperate and brutal, a messy, sprawling fight for survival. He managed to get inside the house through an unlocked kitchen window. The sounds of loud music and drunken laughter from the main hall guided him. He moved silently down a dark corridor and pushed open the door to Silas Croft's study. The man himself was there, standing by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, his composure broke. He was not expecting this. The two men faced each other, the tired soldier, gaunt and grim, and the arrogant king in his tailored suit. "Thorn," Silas said, his voice a low hiss, recovering his composure instantly. "A foolish man. You should have run." "You murdered Abel," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "You framed me. It ends tonight." Before Silas could reply, the study doors burst open. Jedediah stormed in, his face flushed with whiskey and victory, dragging Isabella by the arm. This was the critical moment, the fulcrum on which all their lives would turn. Jedediah was triumphant. He shoved Isabella forward into the room, making her stumble. "Look, father, the blushing bride," he sneered, his voice slurring. "A little reluctant, but she'll learn." Isabella was limp, a doll with its strings cut. Her eyes were vacant, staring at nothing, her body swaying with resignation. She had given up. She raised her head and her gaze met Elias's across the room. There was no fire left in her eyes, no fight, only a bottomless well of despair. She was about to fully submit, to let them win, to end her own suffering by becoming the thing they wanted her to be. Seeing her so utterly broken, something inside Elias shifted. The cold, hard quest for vengeance that had driven him for weeks melted away in the heat of a new, desperate urgency. He was overwhelmed by an all-encompassing need to save her, not just her body from these men, but her spirit from the darkness that was about to consume it. "Isabella," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, sharp and clear. "Look at me." Jedediah turned, his face twisting into a mask of fury. He raised a pistol, aiming it at Elias. "It's over. Yankee!" he spat. But at that exact moment, a great roar came from outside the house. The townspeople, led by Cole the blacksmith, their fear finally burned away by the sight of their neighbors' homes in flames, had been galvanized into action. They stormed the ranch, a makeshift army armed with pitchforks, axes, and a few old hunting rifles. The fight spilled out across the yard, a chaotic explosion of shouts and gunfire. In the confusion of the sudden attack, Elias dove for cover behind a heavy desk, but his focus was entirely on Isabella. As Jedediah turned toward the window, distracted by the chaos, Elias moved. He reached her in 2 long strides and grabbed her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, meant to shake her from her trance. "Don't you let them do this," he pleaded, his voice rough with an emotion so powerful it threatened to choke him. "Don't you let them win! Fight!" He was trying to reignite the defiant fire he had seen in her that very first day in the general store. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and something flickered in her deadened eyes. The sight of him, here against all impossible odds, risking his life not for revenge but for her, was like a lightning strike to her soul. It broke through the fog of her despair. The will to live, to love, to fight, surged back into her with the force of a tidal wave. Jedediah turned back to them, his face a mask of pure rage. He lunged for Isabella, to drag her away, but Elias was there to intercept him. Their fight was brutal, short, and desperate, a whirlwind of flailing fists and grunts of pain in the flickering lamplight. It ended with Jedediah on the floor, still and silent. Elias pulled Isabella away from the center of the room, into a small, protected alcove by a bookshelf, as the chaos of the battle outside raged on. She was trembling violently, gasping for breath, a soul pulled back from the brink of oblivion. She looked up at him, her eyes now alive, filled with a storm of tears, tears of terror, of relief, of an overwhelming, all-consuming love. She leaned her forehead against his chest, her whole body shaking. "I can't fight you any longer," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The line was imbued with a double meaning that he understood instantly. She could no longer fight her feelings for him, the powerful love that had grown between them in the darkness. But more profoundly, she could no longer fight the hope he represented, the difficult, painful, beautiful possibility of a future she had tried to kill within herself just moments before. It was a moment of complete and total emotional surrender, not to her miserable fate, but to him. Silas Croft, seeing his son fall and his empire crumbling in a single chaotic night, did what snakes do when their nests are disturbed. He slipped away. In the confusion, he disappeared into the shadows and was gone. Just then, the storm finally broke. The heavens opened, and the rain came down in a torrential, cleansing flood, dousing the fires across the valley, washing the smoke and the blood from the air. In the middle of the storm, Elias held Isabella close, a quiet, immovable point of stillness, their ordeal far from over, but this crucial, desperate battle finally won. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The storm, which had held its breath on the horizon, finally broke, and the rain came down in a torrential, blinding sheet. It turned the dusty ranch yard into a churning sea of mud, mingling with the blood and the ash. The brief, desperate rebellion of the townspeople, born of fire and fury, quickly fizzled out in the cold downpour. As the flames hissed and died, the terrifying reality of what they had done sank in. They had attacked the ranch of Silas Croft, the most powerful man in the territory. Their righteous anger was washed away by the rain, replaced by a cold, creeping fear of the consequences to come. Through the maelstrom of running men and panicked horses, Cole the blacksmith found Elias and Isabella. His face was grim, streaked with soot and rain. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice a low, urgent rumble. He shoved the reins of two of his own best horses into Elias's hands. A heavy sack of supplies was already tied behind one of the saddles. "The law that comes for this night's work won't be on your side. Not yet. You have to go. Now." There was no time for goodbyes. Elias and Isabella mounted the fresh horses and fled into the deluge, becoming true fugitives. They rode hard into the teeth of the storm, the rain erasing their tracks behind them, the thunder covering the sound of their flight. The opening days of their new life were a harsh education in the reality of being hunted. They were not just evading the remnants of Croft's men who would surely be seeking revenge, but also the law, which had officially branded Elias Thorne a murderer and an arsonist. The vast, unforgiving landscape that had once been a mere backdrop to their story now became an active antagonist. Every open plain was a risk, every box canyon a potential trap. They navigated treacherous, rock-strewn passes, crossed sun-scorched flats with barely enough water in their canteens to wet their tongues, and spent hours lying motionless in thorny thickets, hiding from the dust clouds of passing patrols. In this crucible of survival, their dynamic shifted. In the confines of Redemption Bluff, he had been her protector, a shield against the forces that sought to crush her. But out here, in the raw, untamed wilderness, they became partners. And she was far from helpless. Isabella, drawing on a deep well of knowledge passed down through generations of Montoyas who had lived and breathed this land, proved to be incredibly resilient. She knew which plants held water in their roots, which berries were safe to eat, and how to read the subtle signs of the terrain to find a hidden spring. Her skills were a perfect complement to his. He was the soldier, the tactician, his eyes always scanning the horizon for danger, his hand always ready. She was the survivor, the one who understood the quiet, secret rhythms of the land they were traveling through. He knew how to fight men. She knew how to fight the desert. This forced, constant intimacy stripped away all remaining artifice between them. There were no more stolen glances or whispered words in the shadows. Their lives were now an open book to each other. They huddled together for warmth during the freezing desert nights, his arm a solid presence around her head resting on his shoulder. They shared their last drops of water without a word, each ensuring the other drank first. They tended to each other's injuries, a long, shallow cut on his arm from a sharp rock, a raw rope burn on her hand from a difficult descent. The narrative of their lives slowed down, focusing on these small, vital moments of codependence and care. Their love was no longer a fragile, secret thing. It was in the simple, profound act of sharing a piece of dry hardtack, of keeping watch while the other slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted. By the light of small, smokeless fires made from dry mesquite, they had deep, soul-bearing conversations. He spoke more about the war, not of the battles, but of the men he had known, the friendships forged in fire and lost to it, and of the profound, hollowing disillusionment that followed when he realized the killing had solved so little. She, in turn, spoke of the immense weight of her family's name, the constant pressure she had felt to be strong for her broken father, and she confessed the secret, burning shame she had carried for even considering marrying Jedediah to save herself. They confronted their deepest fears and their most private insecurities, and in doing so, their bond became unbreakable. They were no longer just two people in love. They were a single unit, a new thing forged in the heat of adversity and cooled in the waters of absolute trust. Their journey was fraught with peril. One afternoon, they had a close call with a posse, the jingle of harness and the low talk of men reaching them just in time. They scrambled into a shallow cave behind a curtain of rock, pressing themselves flat as the riders passed just feet away, their hearts pounding in a frantic, shared rhythm. Another time, caught in a narrow canyon, a sudden summer storm turned the dry wash into a raging, muddy river. They barely had time to scramble to high ground, watching the torrent sweep away the path they had just walked. But these moments of high tension were interspersed with moments of quiet, breathtaking beauty that felt like a gift from God. They watched a sunrise over the painted desert, the light setting the red and purple rocks ablaze with color. They saw a herd of wild mustangs, their manes and tails flying, run free across a high mesa. They lay on their blankets under a canopy of stars so bright and numerous they seemed to be within arm's reach, surrounded by a silence so profound it felt holy. In this violent, dangerous world, they learned to appreciate these small, stolen pockets of peace. Their flight eventually led them far south, into a series of hidden canyons that were not on any map. There, they stumbled upon a hidden, isolated community. It was a small, forgotten settlement of Apache, a remnant of a band that had been driven from their ancestral lands years ago by men just like Silas Croft. They were viewed with deep suspicion at first, their presence a potential threat. But Elias and Isabella approached with their hands open and their heads bowed in respect. An elder of the community, a wise old man named Geronimo's shadow, with eyes that seemed to hold the memory of a century, saw the truth of their situation. He saw the weariness in their bones and the honesty in their faces. He saw two people who were not a threat, but were, like his own people, fugitives from a world of greed. He decided to offer them sanctuary. During their time there, as their bodies and spirits slowly began to heal, they learned a crucial piece of information. The Apache knew the history of this land with an intimacy that no surveyor's map could capture. They told Isabella of an old landmarker, a great stone carved with the original Spanish grant survey that had once marked the true boundary of the Montoya Rancho. Years ago, they said, Croft's men had illegally moved it, a full mile to the west, to cheat her family out of their most valuable asset, the land that contained the valley's most reliable springs. And they had a witness, a very old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, had been just a boy when he worked for Isabella's grandfather. He told them, his voice a reedy whisper, of a night he had hidden in the rocks and watched a group of Croft's men, under the cover of a new moon, use a team of oxen to drag the great stone marker to its new, false location. This was it. This was the final, concrete proof of Silas Croft's original crime. the rotten foundation upon which his entire evil empire had been illegally built. At the same time, news from the outside world trickled into the isolated community. They learned that a new United States Marshal, a man by the name of Marcus Rylan, had been assigned to the territory. He was known to be a hard, uncompromising, but scrupulously fair man, a veteran of the war who was said to be completely immune to the influence of money and local power. This was their glimmer of hope. They realized they could not run forever. To truly be free, to reclaim their lives and their honor, they had to return and face the law. But this time, they would not be unarmed fugitives. This time, they would be armed with the truth. Weeks later, Elias and Isabella rode back into Redemption Bluff. They were not the same frightened people who had fled in the night. Their skin was darker from the sun, their bodies leaner and harder, but their eyes were clear and determined. They were weathered, united, and ready for the final battle. They did not ride in with their guns blazing. They rode directly to the sheriff's office, where they found Marshal Rylan himself, already in town investigating the night of fire and chaos at the Croft Ranch. The final confrontation with Silas Croft took place not in a dusty street, but in the town's small meeting hall, which had been converted into a makeshift courthouse. It was a battle not of bullets, but of words, of evidence, and of character. Croft, ever arrogant, had returned to town, believing he could buy, bribe, or intimidate his way out of any trouble. He sat at a table with a high-priced lawyer from back east, his face a mask of aggrieved respectability. His lawyer painted Elias as a violent drifter with a history of insubordination, and Isabella as a hysterical, spurned woman, lashing out with wild accusations. But when Elias stood to speak, he did so with a quiet, unshakable dignity. He told his story simply, without embellishment, his voice steady and clear. Isabella corroborated his account, her voice no longer the whisper of a frightened girl, but the strong, clear voice of a woman who had found her power. The old Apache man was brought in, and with a quiet solemnity, he told the court what he had witnessed as a boy. Finally, inspired by the marshal's unyielding presence and by the raw courage of Elias and Isabella, others found their voice. Cole the blacksmith stood up. Mr. Romero stood up. Even Henderson's widow stood up. One by one, they spoke of the years of intimidation, of the threats, of the violence. The weight of the truth, suppressed for so long, became an undeniable, crushing force in the small, crowded room. Marshal Rylan, after hearing all the testimony, stood up. He walked over to the table where Silas Croft sat, his arrogant smirk finally beginning to fade. "Silas Croft," the marshal said, his voice ringing with authority, "I am placing you under arrest for land fraud, conspiracy, and incitement to the murders of James Henderson and Abel Truman." Croft was stunned. His mask of civility finally shattered, revealing the snarling, cornered predator beneath. He was led away in chains, his reign of terror over at last. The story concludes in the weeks that followed. The legal process would be long and complicated, but the town of Redemption Bluff could finally breathe. The shadow had been lifted. Elias was officially cleared of the murder charge. The Montoya land claim was re-examined in light of the new testimony, and it was clear that their rights, and their land, would be restored. The final scene took place on the small hill where Elias had buried Abel. He and Isabella stood side by side, looking out over the valley. The black scar on the land from the fire was still visible, but new shoots of green were already beginning to push through the ash. The valley was slowly beginning to heal. "We could rebuild it," Isabella said softly, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "Abel's ranch, combine it with my family's land. We could make something new." "It will be hard work," Elias said, though there was no doubt in his voice. The scars from their ordeal were still there. They could be seen in the haunted look that sometimes returned to his clear blue eyes, a shadow of the things he had seen and done. They could be seen in the new, hard-won strength in her posture, the posture of a woman who had been to the brink and had chosen to live. They both knew that life would not suddenly become easy. The West was still an unforgiving place, but now they had each other. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Their love, a thing that had been tested by tragedy, prejudice, and violence, had not only survived, but had become the very bedrock of their new life. The story ends not with a dramatic kiss, but with a quiet, shared look of understanding and hope as they turned from the grave and walked, together, towards the ranch house, ready to begin the hard work of building a future in the land that had cost them so much and had, finally, become their home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.